Well, the last time we talked about the coronavirus as it was just entering
A little bit.
popularity, so to speak.
Right.
And now you've written an article for FEE, that is the Foundation for Economic Education.
Correct. Yep.
And the article's titled, I like the title, Economic Lockdowns Kill People, Yes, Literally. Welcome to the LocoFoco Netcast, episode 11. My name is Timothy Verkula. You can find me on the web at workman.com and on social media at Workman. That's Workman with an I, not an O. This podcast can be found at locofoco.net and our team at locofoco.us. And this episode features Emile, who I talked with on Saturday. So we're here in late May 2020. We've been experiencing the joys of the coronavirus lockdowns. And I think they're the most absurd thing that's happened to the world and maybe in world history. But the article you wrote for FEE wasn't about their absurdity, but about trying to make sense of them rationally. Which article was Economic Lockdowns Kill People? Yes, literally. So that might seem a little bit radical, but maybe you should justify the title. Did you write the title, or was that a FEE special?
Actually, yeah, that's a good question. I actually sent it to sort of well-known libertarian free market think tank gentleman named Fergus Hodgson, who's started a number of programs, including Pan Am Post. I had something about economic thinking in the title, and he said it had viral potential if I changed it to something like that. And I thought, that's a good idea. So shout outs to Fergus Hodgson.
Well, that's the way you do it. You try to go for the shocking title if at all possible, or funny if you can't find shocking. So there you are.
And actually, I thought it was shocking in an accurate way, and it emphasizes just the title. Not to my credit, thanks to Fergus Hodgson. It articulates in just a couple of words exactly the point I was trying to make. And that is that we're not only trading lives for economy when we argue that there shouldn't be lockdowns, but we're trading lives for lives. And I didn't see hardly anybody arguing this or arguing that this could be the case So I just wanted to confront that head on. Let me say that. Here's what I noticed that the whole world did after COVID-19, because we haven't had any, big pandemics within most of our lifetimes, right? Not many of us are 100 years old or more, right? 1918 going back to the Spanish flu.
My father was alive for that, but he was 1 year old, and he died 7 years ago. So there you are.
He was born in 1919, was it?
1917.
So, he was alive for by 1 year. Yeah, got it. In the U.S. as well, right?
Yes.
Let me say before I go in, I did see a couple of documentaries on that particular pandemic because I was trying to look for some way of making sense of seeing what people did back then versus what we're doing now. So during the lockdown, and the strictest part of the lockdown here in New Zealand, I watched documentaries on what's the influenza? I don't want to call it the Spanish because it was everywhere, but the influenza. Both in the U.S. and at least in Great Britain, they indeed had lockdowns, but it wasn't on a national level. It was on a localized level, on a city level, or that kind of thing. I found that interesting.
Yeah, I did too. And you may notice that I have a cat here. She's very interested in what I'm doing, and she's not usually very interested at all in what I'm doing. Anyway,
cat videos have viral potential. So.
Okay, there you are. Well, this could have some disastrous consequences any time now. We'll see how it goes. But there's a case. If we believe the case for the lockdowns in America was made by talking about flattening the curve to save the hospitals. That was the idea. And it was quite explicit at the beginning. And the idea was you didn't want to swamp the hospitals. Yeah. But if that was the case, as far as I understand, if that was the case, if that was the actual rationale rather than the excuse, then the lockdowns shouldn't have been universal. They should have been city by city and region by region. Right. And an area like where I live, there has been like 2 cases and no deaths. And places like this should have waited. to have the lockdown until they got more cases, I would have thought. And so there's a lot of, to me, absurdities involved here. And now people are, worrying that there's going to be an increase in the number of cases when the lockdowns go down. And that's to be expected also. And if it doesn't happen, that actually undermines the original case for the lockdowns.
Agreed, 100%. And in fact, I found it a little bit disingenuous that we were given the reason that, exactly as you said, is because the hospital capacity, numbers of beds and numbers of respirators more specifically, was the reason why we couldn't we couldn't be free and live our normal way of life. But then they go on television and they talk about confirmed number of cases and COVID-related deaths, but they don't talk anything. They don't say anything about hospital capacity, usually. And when they do, it's just New York or something, or parts of California. They don't say what's going on in the case of the U.S. and as a nation as a whole. Here in New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern every single night, and then through social media throughout the day, only talked about these two things, which is, by the way, this is what my article was addressing. It's the epidemiological way of thinking, right? Which is fair enough. I think we need it. But that is, epidemiologists think in terms of reducing spread of infectious diseases. We need that. That's good. Contact tracing is a good idea. All this thing. I don't want to suggest otherwise. What I try to address in the article was only that I think the economic way of thinking takes in to consideration these two main points that the epidemiologists are thinking: confirmed cases and confirmed deaths. But it also takes into the trade-offs of other things, including deaths caused by lockdowns, right? So in order to address that, I have to build a little bit. May I?
Please go right ahead.
Thank you. All right. So, all right. There's a famous YouTube video about a young man who in his 20s that tries to make a toaster all by himself. I don't know if you had time to watch it, but it's a TED Talk and it's amazing. And he's not an economist. He's not trying to make any sort of economics point, but he decides that he wants to be an economy of one, and he wants to make just a toaster. He's from the UK. He goes to the store. He buys an electronic bread toaster that costs less than 4 Great British pounds. And he says, okay, because the cheap toaster will be the easy one that I can take it apart, figure out what went into it, and I can reproduce it like that. So he takes it apart and he finds about 400 different parts. Right. And there's a picture of this. Maybe you can put it at the bottom of the YouTube video. So, but there's a picture of all the parts, all these, like several different wires, many different types of screws, plastic casings, and for this he needs different raw materials. And he's thinking, well, if I'm truly making a toaster and he's right, if I'm truly making a toaster from scratch, I'd actually have to mine my own minerals, get my own mica, my own iron ore to make steel, my own copper, and so on. My own plastic, which he begins with some sort of a wax that he tries to turn into I forgot what kind of plastic to turn into wax for a plastic casing and that kind of thing. So he actually goes to and visits mines, and he sort of implores the people that work there. Can I please go into your mine, and I just need some iron just off the wall. I'll just scratch it off or just chisel it. And they give him permission to do this. And he doesn't mention in the video how many months, but he says he spent several months, and he said he didn't have up to 2 years to do it. So several months, whatever that means. But he spent several months trying to build something that costs less than 4 Great British pounds. And in the end, he shows, and he successfully makes a toaster, and it is an aesthetic nightmare, and it works for about, I think he said 2 seconds or something, and then it just exploded or just, and that's it. Right. This is after months and months and months and months. But I think this very accurately explains why we need a global division of labor, and why we need very niche specialization. Why during pandemics, probably more than any other time, we need the economy moving. There are 7.6 billion of us on the planet, according to the World Bank, and we can't possibly serve others and their needs all around the world if we're not allowed to produce. Just this point. Now, by the way, this isn't making the case that a lockdown couldn't, in any case, be justified for some days or something like that. I'm not even making that case. I do have my biases against them, I admit, but I'm not even necessarily making the case against lockdowns as such. I'm merely trying to think in terms of them rationally with this particular piece. All right. So what's next? Do you have anything to say before I just keep rambling on?
Well, I mean, some of our listeners and viewers will maybe remember Leonard Reid's I Pencil.
Yes, absolutely. I certainly had that in mind.
Because once again, we find out even a very simple thing, the pencil is even simpler than a toaster. And yet it involves thousands of people to make one. Of course, they're not making just one, they're making tens of thousands of pencils. So it's a very interesting, and it's an interesting coordination problem that most people never think about because, well, you take what you have cheap for granted. But cheap comes with a certain obligations and costs. So I think that you probably can expand upon that.
Yeah. And Milton Friedman taking Leonard Reid's short piece and putting it into the 1980 series Free to Choose by PBS. He said all this was made possible by the impersonal prices, basically, right? Mechanism of prices. Is just that, and Hayek makes the point elsewhere, and I cited this in the article, is just that the prices allow us to serve people who we do not know. We are being supported by people who we do not know, and we are supporting the lives of others who we do not know. And we're only able to serve these people all over the world is through prices. We look for profit opportunities and so on, but through the price mechanism, with unhampered or relatively unhampered market prices, we're able to serve complete strangers, many of whom we might not even like, with things that they need. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I noticed that the second part of the quotation from Hayek is one that really gets to the heart of some people's objections to capitalism. He said, profit is the signal which tells us what we must do in order to serve people whom we do not know. And that's something I think that people forget all the time. They think profit is just something that some people get and other people don't, whereas profit is an important part of the whole package.
I agree wholeheartedly, and in fact, it's a very important point. And the sort of, let's say, the defenders of a market system, or maybe we'll loosely call it capitalism, we're often accused of only caring about profit. Maybe some spend too much time only doing that. Fair enough. But I think it's a much more important point, and it goes back to a point that the left often makes, is that it takes a village, right? A society. It's not just you. It's not just me. We're part of an organism. People all over the world. We need one another. And the important point that I would make is it really so bad that people all over the world are serving complete strangers because they're able to better their own lives by doing so? If you were to create like a game theory setup, and how can we make sure that each person that is able to, each player in this game that you come up with, each player doesn't only care about themselves, but they care about others. The best way you could do would be to make it profitable for people to serve others. And then step back and see, oh wait, there's all sorts of people all over the world really, or in this game, really helping one another. I see this as a beautiful thing, not as a negative thing as such.
And it is worth also mentioning to some of our skeptical friends of the markets, it's also a form of cooperation. Trade is a form of cooperation. In fact, because it's so simple on one regard, it's just, usually a trade can be just two people, right? Or two sides, a buyer and a seller, or a seller and a buyer. I mean, it depends on which side is you're looking at. Because of that, it looks simple, but it allows people to make really small decisions over and over and over again, that if you tried to coordinate by some other mechanism, like let's all as a village, as your village, we're going to decide now how to make the pencil. That's a much more difficult thing, because you have to coordinate many people's actions with a grand plan. And the calculation problem is enormous. And there's a reason why human beings had to give up on communism when they went out of tribes. You know, the rudimentary communism of tribes, there is some communism there, but after 200 people or so, we can't keep track of the people. We can't keep track of the honor systems. Everything has to change. And the methods we've used are generally regimentation and force on one side, and trade and cooperation on the other, and piecemeal trades over and over again. It's an amazing thing.
There's a paper, much less cited, much less popular paper by Hayek called "The Atavism of Social Justice," where he makes exactly the same point. He says we live in much smaller societies, we're able to serve one another more in terms of just cooperation, not necessarily trade, not necessarily not as much necessary to use the price mechanism in this, because everybody's ends are known to everybody else's. And plus also in smaller communities, you have more homogeneity. You have a lot of people that with a shared culture and shared values, and not to mention biologically more similar. But once we leave our village, he makes the point that it's not only, of course, the price mechanism, but very interestingly also it's our diversity. It's the fact that we're not the same as everybody else that allows us to find very niche ways in which we can serve people very different than us.
Yeah, I like this theme in part because I am a fan of Herbert Spencer, and Spencer had the exact theme that he brought out in many different places in his oeuvre, the study of the principles of sociology, not least of which. So,
principles of sociology.
Yeah. He was an invisible hand theorist for all of society. He thought that a lot of this worked because of this, and his general picture that you just painted of going from tribe to more complex civilization, that he referred to as progress or evolution. And it's a very interesting and little known aspect of classical liberal thought these days. His vision was very influential in its day, and Gustave de Molinari in France and Belgium repeated it and expanded upon it in economics. And de Molinari's main influence on us today was through Vilfredo Pareto. Pareto was a huge fan. So,
okay.
So that's just a little bit of economic history that no one needed to hear. Anyway, back to the problem at hand. How does this relate to the coronavirus? Let's get back to the point.
Sure. Okay. All right. So just making the point again that we're not just talking about it in terms of lives versus economy. We're talking lives versus lives. So remember those parts in the toaster, these wires, these screws, these plastic casing, these et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, many of these same parts in the toaster, coincidentally, are also used in medical equipment. and as we've seen, nation states all over the world have been telling us what is essential and what is not. And the point I'm trying to make is when manufacturers of, let's say, screws, nuts, bolts, wires, coils, things like this, when they don't know all of the uses, the final goods in which their products are used in, they can't possibly use this knowledge that they don't have to go to a government and say, hey, wait, we're essential, right? So you have to let us work during lockdown, right? The government would just tell them, well, you make screws or you make wires, like, right? It's just, we need a village. And I made this point in the paper, and I'll try to remember it relatively accurately here, but just the point that, so a manufacturer that makes X, right? They sell to a manufacturer. I work in international trade, so I see this all the time. As a manufacturer, you sell to a retailer. Often it's a domestic trading company that then exports the product elsewhere. Then when it goes elsewhere, it's sometimes an importing company. Sometimes that company will go and they'll sell to an industrial supply company, or if it's food, it'll be sold to a store. So, right? But we'll just stick to like machine parts for this case. So once it's sold to an an industrial supply company in another country, that company will then sell on, and then that company might be a manufacturer, and then they'll put it into a final good, what we call a finished toaster, and then it gets exported on elsewhere. Now, the products in this, we'll call it what's normally called a supply chain, what is better called a web of interconnectedness, by using Donald Boudreaux's terminology. I quite like web of interconnectedness better. From the original manufacturer of the machine parts till the final consumer who buys the toaster, the product changes many hands. Not to mention, if we go all the way back and even further back than, let's say, machine parts, and go further back to, let's say, the mining companies that extract raw materials out of the ground, the product goes through so many hands, and it's just so complicated. And so governments cannot possibly possess, nobody can possibly possess all the information they need to know what is essential and what is not, and what is going to save lives and what is not. Yeah, feel free to check, but just want.
Well, it's this idea that they can determine what's essential and what's not is like you say, it's a conceit. They don't know. It's a guess on their part, and they're going to guess wrong. We know that's the case, and maybe a novice in thinking about economics might be helped to realize that many of those parts of the toaster, they go to many different things. It's not just the toaster, right? You made that point, but I think we should stress it, because the little parts that are there that go into many different things, so they're part of a web that makes not only toasters, but also makes respirators and makes oxygenators and whatever they call it for helping people with hypoxia, which is the end state bad situation in coronavirus. And how far ahead, if you're shutting down half the economy, let's just say that's what they've done, like it's maybe more, I don't know. If you shut down half the economy of at least the productive economy, we don't know, as you were saying, just how deeply that's going to affect down the road all sorts of things. It's not just a toaster that isn't going to get made next year because of this 2, 3, 4 month lockdown. It's also respirators and oxygen supplies and electron microscopes, for all I know. I don't know what they're gonna, we just don't know.
Agreed. And it's another point that shutting us all down. I mean, I walked on the street in which I live, which is a very very lively, very diverse area of Auckland, New Zealand. And just today, I counted, I don't know, maybe 7 different businesses in 2 or 3 blocks that they've got closed on the window, or they used to have products in them, and then now that the lockdowns have mostly lightened up and people can be open, all these little businesses have failed. You don't know who. I mean, no matter what they were selling, I don't know what they were selling. It just depends, of course. Those people were paying rent to somebody who was using the money for something else, and along the chain, the money that people were that the people were rationally expecting under normal circumstances outside of a pandemic, they used to make all sorts of other things that certainly would be considered by the governments to be essential. But again, they can't possibly know. And I'll mention the in the U.S., if you go to the Federal Reserve Economic Database and you look, what was the keyword they used for this one? It was initial claims. If you type that initial claims in Fred, and you'll find unemployment rate for the United States. So this is facing you. Normally, you'd expect in a case like maybe a hockey stick in unemployment claims, but it didn't even hockey stick upward. That would imply a sort of a quick, gradual. It just did a right. That's the United States as a whole. And I mean, what is that? And from this we get depression. From depression you get domestic abuse, you get substance abuse, drugs and alcohol. You get all kinds of other things that lead to all sorts of other deaths. What would have been called deaths of despair.
You talked about those in your article. Did you talk
Yes.
about the next level of deaths that come? I mean, there's the people not treated in hospitals, people who can't be treated, people who are starving to death in India. I mean, there are many levels here.
For sure. Yeah, I know about the case of India. India, from when I was paying attention to India specifically a few weeks ago, India seemed to have been hit the hardest because they, by the way, this is almost a first world problem in terms, like, I mean, it's terrible in the first world, but of course in the third world, it's so much worse. You can't just survive for months without work. People hand to mouth.
Yeah, it's astounding. I think when we talked last, I may have dared mention the fact that if you're not producing, at some point you're not eating.
That's right. We
don't know how bad it's going to be in the first world. We know it's bad in the third world. So it's going to be very interesting to see just how we have no experience with, because this isn't a normal depression, like you said. This happened very precipitously, and this is a great suppression, as a term that's been used by Gene Epstein, and I think it's a good term.
And another point I made in the article that I'm forgetting to mention here is that we know that in general it's not just COVID related or pandemics; it's economic depressions in general. We know that it has more of these deaths of despair, and we also know that healthy long-term healthy economies, more affluent societies, what we might call the first world. We know that if you go to the OECD website and you look statistics for the world, not just particular country. You look at for the world. You'll notice if you click infant mortality rates, you'll notice that the countries with the lowest infant mortality rates are the countries that are the more affluent countries, right? You don't find Finland with high infant mortality rates. Also, in terms of longevity, human lifespan, you can also get this from the OECD on the country level basis and beautiful graphs. You see that the countries, the more affluent countries, the countries with the longest human lifespan, you don't find Ethiopia, you don't find Pakistan, you don't find countries like this. You find the Western European countries, the United States, countries like this. So there is, this isn't just a priori. This is we have empirical evidence that economic depressions kill people and lockdowns exacerbate economic depressions. So.
Yeah, this is going to be astounding, and I hope we get out of it soon. You are in New Zealand. I'm in the United States of America, but in New Zealand, they're approaching winter, which is the worst time for the coronavirus. Right, so how are they dealing with that if they're taking the lockdowns away now? What's the climate, the mood?
I certainly know on the part of businesses, there's a lot of uncertainty. Oh, well, on the individual level, household level as well. But for businesses, there's a great deal of uncertainty. Not knowing if they should make even medium to long-term investments, right? Because they don't know if the government's going to shut them down again tomorrow for another month and so on, right? A lot of businesses, they'll go in the red for a short time under normal circumstances, but they can survive it because they see profit at the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. But when it's illegal to produce and it's illegal to sell your goods and services, it makes economic calculation much more difficult, because they're not only dealing with the uncertainties of the market, they're dealing with the uncertainties of the market and the government.
And in contrast to all that, you have the seeming certainty of the politicians and the epidemiologists and the doctors who are advising all this kind of stuff. Though even now, Dr. Fauci is saying that there's a great danger in the shutdowns, so the lockdowns. So I think a turning point has been reached in America. We're going to be out of it soon, I hope. But most of the governors, at least the ones who are Democrats, are very, very interested in increasing the amount of coercion from the government to the individual at the excuse of the coronavirus. So I don't know how big that effect of that is going to be.
Yeah, and it's so odd because I know if you had a Democrat president in there, they would be having the opposite stance. You know what I mean? I mean, supposedly the left is the one that cares more, according to them, right? In the name of social justice, human rights, whatever, they would be arguing against lockdown, saying you're not even letting people make money to put food on their tables and so on. People can't feed their kids, yada yada. But because you have an admittedly buffoonish politician in the presidency who Donald Trump, it's so odd them arguing points that I think if the president was a Democrat, they wouldn't be making at all. They call for, it's so strange, they call for more authoritarianism, and I don't think they even would really want that, to be honest.
Except that maybe we're dealing here with is late stage progressivism. You know, progressivism is the belief in the superiority of states over private enterprise. Technocracy, the elites know how to run the world, and they should. That's the basic idea. That's what progressivism has always been about. And we've got to the point where the young people have no knowledge. I mean, people out of colleges have no knowledge of what businesses really do and what markets are capable of and how necessary they are. All they know is that they've been drilled with the beautiful world of technocracy in the state, which they see as justice and, you know, all the social justice, and they see it as a savior on their issues, and now they think that socialism can work. I suspect they're going to be pushing socialism, and I hope that they're not going to be able to make it stick, that they're crushing of capitalism, so to speak, of markets and business life, is the result of free markets. It's not, obviously. It's the result of government suppressing of economic life. And I hope they're not going to use that as an excuse to put in more government, but they're already doing it in terms of printing money. So we'll see how it goes.
Another point I made in the article, and that it's relevant here, is the printing money and the oh man, it's like Zimbabwe, or you know, their solution to everything is, oh well, no, we don't have to worry about all these people that are employed. We'll send them checks, or we'll just deposit money in their bank account. We got that. We got this. Right? That hasn't worked out well anywhere. The Roman Empire pioneered coin debasement. It just hasn't worked anywhere. It hasn't worked anywhere, whether with coin debasement or fiat money system. At least under Bretton Woods, you were tied to a gold standard, and we're post Bretton Woods, so they can print whatever they want.
Yeah, and once again, I look at it as magical thinking. I mean, really, it's money is magic to them, and moving money around is what governments do so well, you know, and that's how they get things done. But they forget that the point of what we call an economy is to produce things that people use. And they have this idea that all we need is money, and actually we need to have production. But so many people really only exist in, you might say, the government sector, or the areas that are kind of far away from production of everyday life goods, that they kind of forget that that's where actually it's all pyramided on top of an amazingly productive society, but they've switched off. I think it's crazy.
Yeah.
And so your point of your article, by the way, I should mention that it's a brief article and people should read it. And you've already mentioned that you have covered many subjects in it. And so it is actually very concise. You certainly don't go overboard on length, and it's very well done.
I'll say that again. I'll reiterate the point just for any naysayers out there. I'm not against. I admit a bias against lockdowns, but I'm actually not against lockdowns as such. Right? This is indeed a trolley problem we're dealing with. Right? Particularly because I think of the 2-week incubation period where someone is both infectious, has the disease, is both infectious, and the disease happens to be for a certain percentage of the population of a certain demographic, the elderly and so on. It is indeed deadly for a lot of them. Right? Now, if a disease isn't I've noticed in policy, nobody argues that policy should be changed in any way unless 2 variables are present. One is highly infectious and the other is deadly. If something is highly infectious but not deadly, nobody suggests that we have to rearrange our lives about it, right? And if something's deadly but it's not highly infectious, if it kills 1-2 people, we just go about our lives. We just accept the risk that, you know, the odds are low that I'll get it, and so on. But in this case, I indeed consider it to be a worth consideration, that maybe we should consider that under normal circumstances, to doing things that under normal circumstances we wouldn't want to do, particularly, again, because this 2-week incubation period where we can't even know, because some people are asymptomatic, right? We can't know all the people that have it. So we can't just isolate. We can't just see someone that's coughing, know it's from COVID, and say, okay, only you have to go home until you're for 2 weeks, right? We don't know. There's so many people touching doorknobs and elevator buttons. Yeah.
Though it sounds like the CDC has retracted their insistence on the importance of surfaces. They say that very few people get the coronavirus through surface contact. It's almost
really?
Yeah.
I did not see that.
This last week they took it back. What we're learning about the coronavirus is very interesting, though. You know, for the under 60 population, the coronavirus is less bad than a normal flu. It's only for the at-risk populations that it's really, really bad. Mm-hmm. And I think that really should clarify our minds a little bit. Once again, this is not the subject of your essay. Your essay is about how dangerous it is to fiddle with a complex system and expect to get, you know, rosy outcomes from hastily constructed policy.
Indeed. And that, at least here in New Zealand, the Prime Minister comes on the news every night, or at least during the worst parts of the lockdown. And she and her health minister present on, for today, here's the new confirmed number of cases, and here are the number of COVID-related deaths. And they present these two numbers. Again, this is the epidemiological way of thinking, not the economic way of thinking, because it doesn't look at trade-offs. It only looks at this very narrow vision. So what I'm saying is now these models are important, but simultaneously, in these same presentations to the public every night, they should be saying, okay, now here is our model. Here's our other model. And here are all the deaths that we forecast because of the lockdown, right? But they don't even try to, right? Because it's not easily seen. This is Bastiat's point, what is seen versus what is unseen. It's not as easily seen, so they don't bother with it, right? It's very narrow-minded thinking, you could say.
Right. And, you know, this idea of the seen and unseen is really important to reiterate every time we talk about economics, really, because this is the kind of main point. But what is the cause of why are there unseen things out here? Part of it's because, as Garrett Hardin pointed out, you can't do just one thing, right? For every cause and every action we take as a cause for the effects, there are more than one effect. And when we have an ends and means structure on the world, we imagine, let's say, the effects of our action, and the good effect that we like, we select as the end. And then if it meets the costs that we perceive, if it's over the cost, then we engage in the action. The thing is that all those other effects are important, and the job of the economist is to actually be a little bit cognizant of the complexity of choice. And I don't think most people really get that. Once again, I think the Robinsian definition of economics is worth pointing out here too, because economics being the study of scarce means servicing competing ends. And here, that's exactly what you're talking about. We have competing ends. One of them is to reduce the number of deaths and to reduce the contagion if we can. But another competing end is not dying of starvation, not dying of cancer because the hospitals have basically been closed because of the coronavirus. There's many, many competing ends here that are not being considered. That's kind of one of your main points is. So Lionel Robbins' definition is useful to remember here, because that is what the job of economics is, to look at the ends and means structure of all our choices. And policies have to evaluate not just the ones they're looking at, right? Not just the ones we're focusing on. That's a focusing illusion, right? If you only look at a few things, then you're only looking at a very narrow part of the economic problem.
Indeed. And I'll say that even if we look at the COVID-related deaths and confirmed cases, along with what I suggested, which is deaths caused by lockdowns, no matter which you forecast, let's say reasonably, to have a higher death rate, and all the non-death negatives aside, we might. I think in fact, I know everybody to a point is willing to accept higher risk in exchange for their liberties. And to emphasize the point, I'll use the one that tends to be used in a lot of economics textbooks, and that's that you can indeed reduce the automobile driving accident rate down to zero by making the posted speed limit be about 5 miles per hour, or let's say 10 kilometers per hour, because I'm in New Zealand. But nobody wants to live in that world. People prefer risk to a point. People prefer risk with this trade-off. They prefer the risk and because they want the liberty of being able to drive faster. It's a trade-off most people will accept very happily.
Yeah. Now, I have a much more dark vision of why we have these lockdowns. I mean, I consider it, these people think in terms of magic. I've used it before, and I'll probably never stop using the magic analogy, because they really do have a magician's instinct.
Mindset, yeah.
And one of those things that magicians do is that they distract their attention away from the trick. And so the most obvious thing here are the deaths and the hospital overload, which started out with. But the trick is something else, and the trick is to get rid of all your liberties. And why do they want that? Well, I think that in a sense, many of these people like it. It's falling out along ideological lines, and progressives like to suppress capitalism. Why? Because they don't trust capitalism, and they want to take over everything. That's part of their mindset is technocracy, and they think they have the fatal conceit, as Hayek once again put it. And I think that this is the reason we're experiencing this is because there's a huge third of the population is very gung-ho on the lockdowns, in part because they think in terms of the magic of the state, and the state isn't magic. And in fact, there's always going to be costs for every policy and action. And I think liberty just works better, and property rights work better, and then this kind of thing. And as I mentioned in our previous conversation, it's entirely natural for our habits to change during a period of contagion. So people would start wearing masks, and we should expect people to wear masks. And the government, all they needed to have done is say, maybe we should start wearing masks. But I think there's actually even some deeper things. How they handled the hospital problem, I think, was the exact wrong way. And I think we're seeing that because all the local hospitals here are in danger of going out of business because they've pretty much shut down all the business. It's very little use of hospital right now because everybody's afraid of the coronavirus. This is a very weird consequence of the coronavirus, but it is nevertheless a problem of costs and benefits.
I've seen a lot of the hospitals are sort of, they're going on YouTube and they're going on writing articles saying, we're empty. There's a few COVID-related things, and there are all these surgeries that I know that people need. Yeah, that's another thing I didn't address in the article. People that need surgeries, and they're told, you can get that after the lockdown. Is anybody trying to measure the people that needed a surgery more than the government would have liked to admit? And because they postponed it, maybe they died during a lockdown and so on, or shortly thereafter, because often having a surgery sooner rather than later is essential to that person's life. Basically,
they've turned America. I know America doesn't have socialized medicine like they do in Canada and Britain and elsewhere, but the problems that leftists keep on denying are problems for socialized medicine. That is, their rationing problems. Well, rationing by waiting is the traditional way that socialized medicine systems work. They make some people wait and they die. Those people, well, that's happening to a whole nation here now, and a nation that's used to speedy medical treatment, and they're not getting it anymore. So that's it's an interesting effect. We're getting socialism, the worst parts of socialism, for the stupidest reasons, as far as I can tell.
Preach it, brother.
Well, so that was a pretty good article of yours. People should go to fee.org and look for economic lockdowns kill people. Yes, literally. And it's by Emile or Fanouf, or however you pronounce that name. And I love the name. It's great that you wrote the piece. And I'm astounded that we don't see more pieces like it, in a sense. Because this is the basic stuff. This is what economists are supposed to know. And
interesting. I tried to publish the article with three of the bigger newspapers in New Zealand first, with a sort of a New Zealand focused version of it, including one that I've published with before, and 2 of the 3 they were corresponding with me. Yeah, send your submission. And as soon as I sent, silence, like they didn't want to publish that. And it's incredibly disheartening because I didn't have an anti-government stance in the paper. That none of that was the point. I was only saying, hey, we need to look at trade-offs, and because we could end up accidentally having more deaths with lockdowns than we would without lockdowns. And in fact, certainly if we try to keep this going for any extended period of time, we know that humans, 7.6 billion of us can't stay alive without us serving people we don't know all over the world. Producing and that kind of thing.
But there is a deep prejudice against that kind of thinking. I want to tell a little story. This is because when I was I consider myself a liberal in as a teenager, but I was an odd liberal because I was interested
in the American sense of the word, left of center liberal.
Yeah, that kind of. But I was also very interested in utopian socialism and anarchism, so that's not a normal kind of liberal. So the seeds of my undoing were pretty obvious pretty early. But when I was told, when I encountered the idea for the first time that the minimum wage legislation wouldn't have the effects that are billed for it, it would actually hurt the poor rather than help the poor. When I heard that, and I was out of high school by that time, I had never heard anyone say anything like that. It was just, that's not something you question when you're a kid. But when I discovered this, my reaction was to study economics and to study the case of the critics of minimum wage legislation and why were they saying such a thing like that. But what I've learned over time is that when I mention this idea to most people, that is not their reaction. They're not concerned that their policy may be bad and have bad consequences. They're concerned that you don't like their policy and that you're some sort of evil person. Yeah. And that's a religious reaction. That is a political, tribal reaction. It has nothing to do with rationality. And it has, I think, nothing to do with wanting to help the poor. It has nothing to do with it. This is all about bigotry. And I would say
and virtue signaling.
Yes.
Trying to virtue, like you just argued a rational case, maybe even convinced me that raising the minimum wage doesn't help people whose labor is worth less that to an employer. I concede your point, but I still advocate it because it's important for me and my social standing with my friends that I continue to believe it and advocate it. It makes no sense.
Yeah, it's the part of human nature that I like the least, probably. And I've been around some creeps too, but that's not creepy. That's a kind of different kind of evil, but it is a kind of evil because it is doing harm with a kind of malign intent. It's not an outright malignity, but it is a careless disregard for the life of others and doing something that actually is directly against the people they say they're helping. Because the minimum wage legislation is an example of, on the face of it, what it is disemploying people below a certain rate. It's not saying you must be hired. It's saying you can't be hired at that rate. And so then you have to think, okay, will people hire at the new rate? You have to rethink the whole thing. And people don't often know what they're doing in politics. And I think that we're seeing a lot of that right now, is that the lockdowns are being promoted for reasons that are elusive. For one thing, they've changed. Like you say, they talked about the hospitals in the beginning, and then they switched to talking only about deaths and contagion levels.
Yeah, it reminds me of the George W. Bush year. You keep moving the goalposts, and like first it's to save the Iraqis, and then once, or first, he has weapons of mass destruction, and once we discover that that's not it, we move the goalposts, and we're like, whoa, regime change, and save people from Saddam Hussein, this evil dictator. They keep moving the goalposts. I'll also say, because I assume we'll have some people on the left that watches, and no problem from as far as I'm concerned, not personal or anything. So wanted to make the point that I assume you'll agree with me, that people on the right tend to be equally cultish and equally buffoonish in their logic. To make one point, during the Bush years, the Democrats were against drone strikes and against the Patriot Act and so on. And as soon as Obama came in, they were really quiet about that. In the same way that during the Obama years, the Republicans were against these huge stimulus plans, right? And then once Bush comes in, as I understand, even bigger stimulus plans than the ones that the Republicans were against, the Republicans are quiet about that. So it goes both ways. We're culty.
Oh, that's very true. That's very true. I don't know if it's equal, but it certainly is stark and bizarre. Because some of us, maybe it's because I'm partly autistic or something, that I look at things rationally rather than look things in the terms of tribes that I'm supposed to belong to. So I can be criticized for that, at least. Well, anyway, I thank you, Emile. It's been great hearing from you, and it's been great to get a good explication of the most basic truth of our time. Thank you for tuning in to LocoFoco Netcast for the last week of May in 2020. I want to thank Emile again for sharing his thoughts on his article from fee.org. Go to fee.org to find it, and go to locofoco.net to see the hosted version of this podcast. That's on SoundCloud. Or subscribe on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. You can find the team at locofoco.us. Thanks.